Thank you all for coming here. I am, of course, if anybody doesn't know me, I am Sofia Perez. I am a faculty member in political science. I'm also a member of the Center for the Study of Europe here. And I want to thank the Center for the Study of Europe for making our guest lecture today possible. Our guest lecturer today is Professor Georg Menz, who is the Dragas Chair of International Relations at Old Dominion University. And Professor Menz has a very prominent career, having been in various different universities, including the European University Institute, Goldsmith College in London, the University of London. I'm trying to think of all of them, but I've had my notes here, so I perhaps better go back to them. He's also been a professor at the LUISS Guido Carli University in Italy, and the Australian National University, and the University of Pittsburgh. And in addition to that, he is the author of a number of different books, all dealing with some aspect of present-day democracy, including social policy, labor policy, European integration, and the politics of migration. His current project, which he is here today to talk to us about, is about the decline that we see in a lot of European countries in particular, but not only European countries, of parties that represent what we might call the center left. Okay? And he will explain why this is perhaps somewhat less of an issue in the United States because of our electoral system, but it is has been a very important trend in recent years and even recent decades. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Professor Menz. Let me just say that this is being recorded by the Center for the Study of Europe, which means that if you ask questions at the end, you will be recorded, but I don't think anybody else's visual image is recorded. Am I right about that? Yes, so you can rest assured of that. So,
okay.
Welcome, Georg.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sofia, for your very kind remarks and for introducing me to the group. Good morning. My name is Georg Menz. I traveled up here from Virginia. I am presenting to you today a book project that I worked on for the past year and a half, in which I and a number of my authors from around Europe study the downfall and the downward trend of Europe's center-left parties. And what I'm doing in my talk this morning with you is to focus on the core themes that I roll out in the introductory chapter. And in doing so, we try to identify what is driving the relatively poor electoral performance, and as we'll see also the downward trend in party membership that is so remarkable. So thank you very much to Sofia, to Elizabeth, and to the Center for hosting me and for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. I'll be speaking for about 45 minutes, and then I'll open up the floor for questions on the floor. Oh, actually, I do have to wear that. I just remembered. All right. So, to start off with a little bit of data, and I hope this is legible, even the last row. What we have. It's difficult. Okay, I'll read out loud if need be. So what we were struck by to begin with, what opened this project in a way, was the fact that throughout most, not all, but most European countries, there's been a marked decline in the electoral performance of the center-left parties. Whether they call themselves socialists or social democrats, they have been really hurting quite significantly over the course of the past 2 decades or so. These were formerly catch-all parties of the center-left. They tended to do very well. and tended to comfortably poll around 40% or so and score accordingly in the national elections. And if you look at what's happening over the course of the past 2 decades, you see that practically across Europe, with some exceptions, you see a fairly decided shift downwards, right? If you look at the electoral performance, even in the Scandinavian heartlands, for example, in Sweden, right, we had between 1990 and 2005 an electoral performance of the Social Democrats of around about 40.2%. And then more recently, between 2006 and 2020, that score came right down to 32.2%. This shouldn't really be happening in what was once upon a time ago one of the preserves of European social democracy. Right? If you look over to Britain, it's a similar story of decline. Right? We used to, with Labour, do reasonably well. We used to have about 38.1% there between 1990 and 2005. And between 2006 and 2020, that score comes down to 32.9%. That's so Labour has not won an election in the United Kingdom since 2005. That was 17 years ago. Look at Germany, right? The Social Democrats there used to also be a catch-all party, used to, in its heydays, score north of 40%. Between 1990 and 2005, we recorded a score of 37.3, and then after 2006, and the more recent period, that's to say between 2006 and 2020, the German Social Democrats have come down to 26.2%, and they likewise have not won an election since the last Social Democratic Chancellor left office in 2005. They have, of course, most recently secured the post of Chancellor again, but as I will make clear in a few minutes' time, that is not so much winning as not losing. So if you look at some of the smaller European countries, it's a similar story. France is, of course, not a small country, but is equally also affected. So the data really point into one direction, and that is a sagging, a softening of the support, and in some cases, really a fairly significant decline. There are a couple of exceptions which I'll comment on as well. There are a number of attempts, both by scholars in the academic literature and by journalists and pundits and think tank authors out there to try to make sense. They try to grapple with this as well and try to identify what might be causing this decline. And what I've done here on this slide is collect some of these alternative explanations, which we studied and probed, and in the end decided to reject because they didn't hold water. The first one is that in many ways we are still coping with a long delayed fallout from the 2008 Lehman Brothers meltdown, the implosion of the real estate bubble in this country, and then the ramifications of that for Europe, which of course crossed the Atlantic and led to a credit freeze there, to a private debt and bank debt crisis becoming a sovereign debt crisis, and that leading to years of recession. So the first explanation that is to be found in the literature essentially argues that the left is being punished for this because the left didn't respond in a way in which voters approved of. That is to say, they didn't, the left didn't go, you might say, into a left-wing direction, but rather, of course, in responding to the crisis, to the extent that left-wing governments were in charge, the response tended to be very middle of the road. Banks were saved. There was no real punishment for the bankers. There was no real massive re-regulation of the economy. So in that sense, the response was not, you might say, a leftist one, but it was much more of a mainstream centrist one. On the face of it, that might seem like a compelling narrative. The trouble with that is that it doesn't really hold water empirically. There's simply no evidence to suggest that that is what compels voters. Right? Voters are not too fussed about this, and they don't really seem to be too concerned anymore about the way in which the left, where it was in power, and as we've seen, that wasn't always the case, but where it was in power, dealt with '08. A second explanation goes back even a little further in time, and it points back to the early years of the 21st century, the aughts or the noughts. And during that time, Europe's center-left started to experiment on political economy themes with a bit more of a centrist, critics would say, neoliberal approach towards economic policy making. That is to say, it abandoned topics such as redistribution through high taxation. It tried to reinvent and recast the welfare state and making it a bit more punitive and a little less generous. Try to, in other words, experiment a bit more with sticks rather than carrots to prod and cajole individuals back into the labor market. And all that, again, is of course not classic left-wing policy. And here the argument runs that voters essentially are still, or perhaps again, upset about this and are seeking retribution or revenge by punishing voters now. So the left has, you might say, a delayed effect it has to deal with and is now being punished by voters jumping ship. And again, we looked into that and tried to probe it empirically, and I didn't really find a great deal of evidence for it. Instead, what we'll be looking at, and what we did look at, is the question to what extent it is actually possible to identify in the here and now what social democracy and what socialism with a small s, not a capital S, might stand for in the 21st century in Europe. And in many ways, one of the real challenges that the left has to deal with is how to position itself on political economy issues, by which I mean issues such as the welfare state and the labor market. So that, on the one hand, and on the other hand, how to deal with issues that have more to do with social cultural questions, right? Identity politics, immigration, multiculturalism, homosexual rights, etc. And it isn't always easy to keep a party together that on social cultural issues is perhaps tempted to veer towards the left, where not all voters will follow. And similarly, it is not easy to keep a party together that is sometimes tempted to veer towards the right on political economy, where again, voters are perhaps not all that comfortable going. So that is one of the fundamental challenges, and it seems to me that, and many of you are in Sofia's class, that that's a question perhaps also worth pondering in this country with respect to the Democratic Party, because of course in this country we have a similar internal struggle. We have a very different electoral system, so the particularities are not identical, but the Democratic Party likewise has to decide a bit where it stands on social cultural vis-a-vis political economy issues. So the question then is, what does the left represent in the 21st century? And towards the very end of the book, we also try to identify ways forward, and in doing so, we essentially are revisiting this challenge or this quagmire. How do you, on the one hand, please those voters that are comfortable with moving towards the left on these kind of social cultural issues, and how do you not lose voters who would rather the left retain a decidedly left of center focus with regards to political economy, labor market issue, and welfare state questions. These are the countries we focus on. These are the countries that are in the book. For reasons of time constraints, I'm not going to dive into the empirical details in every single European country, but instead what I will do is present the 6 core themes that we look at in the book together. And then perhaps in the second part of this morning's event, if you do have questions, I'll field them as well as I could. The findings are actually quite interesting in many ways. 2 countries that I will just single out very briefly are countries where the general trend does not seem to hold. That is to say, where there's been a little bit of a bounce back, where the left has moved back. And those 2 countries are, first of all, Austria, where the left has, in some sense, shed its third-way experimentation of the early 2000s and is now making much more, you might say, classically left-wing noises when it comes to issues such as regulating the economy, providing a safety net, working on public pensions and actually raising the level of their generosity. And in that sense, the Austrian Social Democrats seem to be moving towards the left, and they seem to be rewarded for that trajectory by the electorate in Austria. So that seems to be working quite well. The other country that is worth taking note of is Denmark, and again, the Danish Social Democrats similarly seem to have come back out of the trove a little bit, and they have done that by moving towards the center on the question of immigration. That's to say, they've abandoned multiculturalism. They now stand for a more restrictive stance on immigration, and particularly on integration. That's to say, they make the receipt of welfare benefits for immigrants, especially asylum seekers, contingent on participating in the labor market, taking Danish language classes. They also try to avoid ethnic segregation, either self-segregation or imposed segregation. That's to say, they are putting in place upper limits for the number of asylum seekers living in certain districts of especially urban Denmark. So in so doing, they are trying essentially to avoid a kind of segregation which breeds parallel societies and breeds a lack of assimilation into the broader Danish society. And by doing so, again, they seem to be doing quite well. They seem to be tapping back into the voter clientele that they lost, the blue-collar voters that were very unhappy about the more left-wing immigration policies. And they're also winning back voters from the far right. I should also say that when we're talking about the decline of Europe's center-left, right, sometimes tempting to poke holes into that general declinist thesis by looking at countries that seemingly buck the trend. That we recently had the center-left win elections in Portugal. We have also seen a return into office in the three Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden, Denmark. Germany now has a social democratic chancellor again. So just to deal with that concern real quickly, if you look at the Nordic countries first, yes, the Social Democrats are in power, but what we're seeing there is somewhat of a Netherlandization. That's to say, the party landscape is becoming much more pluralistic. It's breaking up into many, many more parties than used to be the case. Social Democrats, by historical standards, are much weaker than they used to be, even in those heartland countries. With regards to Germany, you similarly have to bear in mind that the Social Democrats managed to cross the finish line. They got into office by virtue of being the strongest party last fall, that's true, but they, if you look again at the electoral score, are nowhere near their historical highs. And they rely on a fairly unwieldy coalition. That is to say, they have shed an enormous amount of voters, and in many ways they have arguably not so much won the elections as not lost them, because the Christian Democrats did so extremely poorly. So it's debatable whether that is really undermining our thesis. That seems to be more a combination of very contingent factors. And Portugal is a bit different structurally because some of the dilemma I described earlier, that is to say the left struggling to keep on board people who are comfortable with a left-wing shift on social cultural issues, that's typically your urban, cosmopolitanly oriented, university-educated, upwardly mobile, often fairly youngish group of individuals. These people make up for a very, very small proportion of the voters in Portugal. So in that sense, Portugal is structurally a bit different from Northern Europe. And in that sense, again, I wouldn't attach too much significance to the Portuguese seemingly moving into a somewhat different direction here. Okay, so to our 6 themes, and as you will see, some of them are probably not entirely unfamiliar, right? I think it's always interesting to study Europe from these shores because we discover that so much is actually comparable. If we look across the Atlantic, we find a lot of developments and events occurring that actually ring a familiar bell. Again, mutantis mutatis, of course. It's not true that the United States is some kind of geographically challenged European country, far from it. But there's a lot there going on that I think is probably familiar and also pertains to the social democratic equivalent, the Democrats in this country. Right, Sofia and I were just chatting, and one of the trends, for example, in this country is that the Democrats are struggling to retain non-college graduates, that is to say, the classic blue-collar voters, especially if they're male, especially if they're white, right? But they're now also starting to lose the non-white, non-university educated working class in this country. So Latinos and blacks who are not university educated now are also starting to at least consider voting for the Republicans, which was unthinkable a generation ago. Back to Europe, right, we have simply a quantitative decline in how many blue-collar folks there are out there. That is to say, the very size of the working class milieu is shrinking. That is a problem for the center-left. There is a related demographic problem, and that is that those people that are classically blue-collar individuals are aging, and some of them are not just aging, but by now passing on, right? So we have, in some sense, a particular core clientele, which is shrinking in size, quite literally shrinking in size. And the Social Democrats are struggling a bit to tap into either those that are seeking employment in the service sectors, or those that are technically in the service sector, but really probably should be thought of as part of the precariat, because they fall into the extremely deprived and low socioeconomic echelons, right? These are your delivery drivers, right? These are your contingently employed individuals in the new gig economy, quote unquote. Related to that, nothing empirically new, but of course nevertheless interesting and important for our project. We also really see a sagging of trade unionization levels, of which more in a minute, but that again, of course, bodes very poorly, because this is the core clientele that the Social Democrats connected to, grew out of, and purported to speak on behalf. And in many ways, the whole movement started because it wanted to give voice to the working class, to blue-collar individuals. Where that group of people is shrinking, you have an obvious problem as to who you stand for, what you represent, and what kind of positions you try to convey. The exceptions to that, we don't see a deunionization trend in Scandinavia, and in Belgium, similarly, we have a country that always stands out, but that is due to a number of particularities I could go into, right? Essentially, the unions in these countries are involved in administering unemployment compensation. So it's, in that sense, very attractive to remain in the trade union, no matter your age, no matter your background. And it's, in that sense, explainable, and has perhaps a little less to do with politics. Number two, we're saying the center-left needs to put on its thinking cap a little bit and think through what the next big project might be, that is to say, where it might position itself with regards to the changes to the labor market, with regards to the intensification of globalization and competition with other parts of the world. So we're pointing here to a weakness, and that is ideological or programmatic in nature. We're saying there's somewhat of a void when it comes to big picture ideas. We had a big picture idea in the 20th century, and that was the welfare state, but the welfare state is, and it actually has long been since constructed. It's finished, it's done. We need something new. And the third way very clearly has been abandoned, probably for the better, but it's not entirely clear yet what the next major ideational project might be. There is a little bit of flirtation in a number of national social democratic parties with what one might call NeoKeynesianism, that is to say the idea that now that COVID has hit, now that there are still some remnants of the impact of 2008, perhaps it's time to dust off Mr. Keynes' books and start raising demand stimulation once again. The trouble with that, of course, is that to the extent that these countries are part of the Eurozone, that runs against at least officially runs against the limits on public debt and public deficits that are part of the Maastricht criteria. So to the extent these criteria are still respected, and arguably they are not being respected very much at all anymore, but to the extent that these theoretical targets still have some degree of validity, that is clearly not a real option. Second issue is changes to the labor market, right? We are on the cusp of major change there. We're going to see a lot more, especially relatively unqualified jobs being shed. We're probably going to witness a great deal of upskilling as a necessity for workers. That has significant ramifications with regards to employment levels, regarding education, regarding perhaps also the welfare state. How do we deal with individuals who are essentially made redundant and very hard to redeploy, re-employ? And then finally, there is somewhat of a question mark over where Europe stands when it comes to cutting-edge IT-based technological breakthrough, right? We have our FANGs, right? We have our Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google. The Chinese have the equivalent to that. We have a number of companies that are very well positioned in breakthrough industries. It's not really clear what Europe has as an equivalent, right? The Europeans are essentially using US companies. But where are, you might say, the next potential competitors to your Facebooks or to your Amazons or to your Googles coming out of Europe? Right? And the answer is, to the extent that we see promising startups, they tend to get bought up relatively early on. So there isn't perhaps enough by way of venture capital or private equity funding available. But here what we're simply drawing our readers' attention to is the fact that the Social Democrats seem to be not doing a very good job in articulating some kind of vision with regards to how to respond to these challenges that are starting to become ever more present, ever more visible. Okay, number 3. Time was the center left had people representing it, both in senior party leadership positions and in parliament, that actually came organically from a working class background, right? They're not university graduates, they really rose the ranks, often through the trade unions, not always. Right? They were construction workers, they were factory workers. They knew their clientele inside out, right? They had organic relations. They came from this sort of background. That's really no longer true today. We went into a bit of empirical detail and shed some light on the background of parliamentarians. Where do they come from in terms of socioeconomic background? Right? What is their previous profession? Are they college graduates? Yes, no. Where do they fit in, so to speak? And we found that by and large, the organic link is at least damaged, if not broken altogether, between the very clientele that center-left used to purport to represent and the party, its organization, its network, and its parliamentarians. So increasingly, you have somewhat of a professionalization going on, right? It's no longer the former construction workers that are sitting in parliament. Instead, you have relatively smooth, relatively slick individuals representing the parties. These are more often than not university graduates, and they graduate into party positions or into the ecosystem of the party, for example, affiliated think tanks or similar, and then from there they leapfrog into parliament. But what they don't really do is spend a great deal of time soaking and poking in the very milieu that they purport to speak for. So in that sense, their knowledge of what it's like to be on a factory floor, on a construction site, on a farm, is essentially theoretical. That they've never really had any first-hand experience in dealing with those kind of workplaces. That can be a problem, right? And it makes it a bit more harder to relate to people of that background. It makes it a little less credible to pretend to speak on behalf of people you know from books only. And it is hurting the party and the party movement, in our view. Okay, the fourth theme is to do with the last major project of the center-left in Europe, and that is, of course, the welfare state. The welfare state was in many ways drawn up with the realities of the first half of the 20th century in mind. What do I mean by that? I mean by that we were at the time assuming that folks were getting married at a relatively young age. They were having a steady number of children. Marriages lasted. And by and large, we assumed a male breadwinner model. That's to say the man went out and sought full-time employment, remained employed, and the woman was not required to go to work in many cases, and tended to stay at home being a homemaker and a mother. We also assumed that our male workers were employed full-time and that they remained employed throughout their employable years, right, up until their pension age. The trouble is, of course, that over the course of the second half of the 20th century, many of these assumptions simply no longer hold much weight. That's to say, society has changed quite radically. Employment patterns have changed radically. Like we see a lot more atypical part-time work. Demographics have changed, right? We see delayed childbirth. We see on average much smaller families, in fact, often very small families. We also have, in that sense, perhaps related, we have a pattern of a relatively high percentage of marriages ending in divorce. So the assumption that marriage as an institution would create some kind of pillar, which would of course have to feature in the design of the welfare state, is today no longer tenable. We also have, as I mentioned here on the slide, as a problem, the growth in long-term structural unemployment. And again, the presumption in the design of the welfare states across Europe was always that unemployment would be a temporary problem for individuals, but it could be remedied. There would be a way to essentially upskill and redeploy individuals, so there would never be a period during which there would be long-term structural unemployment with a significant number of people out of the labor market. These are all presumptions that today are unrealistic, weren't unrealistic during the first half of the 20th century, but the trouble is today we simply cannot build on these pillars anymore. Right? They simply hold no weight anymore. So we'd have to really think about ways of redesigning, updating and recasting the welfare state and putting it more in tune with the social and the economic realities of the early 21st century. And in many ways, the third way, for all its flaws and for all its somewhat faulty logic and for all its perhaps somewhat fluffiness, you might say, was an attempt to try to do exactly that. It was an attempt to modernize the welfare state, dust it off, and in particular avoid long-term dependence on welfare state benefits. So time would be ripe to rethink the welfare state and to put it more into tune with today's realities, but we don't really see a great deal of focus on that, and there's a lot of room there for improvement. Okay, the fifth issue is immigration. That immigration has become certainly a very topical issue. It's also very divisive politically. And, most European countries today de facto have accommodated an enormous number of immigrants. We have countries which have 9, in some cases, double-digit, 11, 13% of the population being foreign-born. Right? Those are record levels. They're extremely high even by American standards. Right? In our country, we have around about 12% of the population that is non-US born, but we, of course, have historically done a much better job in incorporating our immigrants, and it must be said, also by American standards, 12% is very high by historical standards. These are countries that historically have not defined themselves as countries of immigration. They have become de facto targets of immigration. And the challenge for the center left is now how to deal with that. And here we're getting towards what I described earlier as a social-cultural clash, a social-cultural challenge. Because historically the center left in Europe have tended to be relatively cautious about immigration. It wasn't a big cheerleader, it wasn't too enthusiastic, and it took that position because it represented the lower socioeconomic echelons, right, where the effects of immigration are particularly tangible. So the center left was worried about taking in excessive numbers, about a lack of integration, and about the negative fallout, in particular on wages, wage levels, working conditions, drain on public services, effects on neighborhoods, effects on social cohesion, and the effects on real estate, on education, on healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. It's not to say that the center left was xenophobic, but rather it was cautious. Right? It was somewhat torn between, on the one hand, a somewhat internationalist logic, right, and the logic about international solidarity, and being the spokespeople of a working class who would have to deal with particularly low-skilled immigration in the first instance. Right? So it was always a little bit torn, and it dealt with that internal conflict by taking a somewhat cautious stance on immigration throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And then in the 21st century, this side of the year 2000, it started to change its tune quite dramatically in a number of European countries. It moved much more to the left, but it advocated immigration. It embraced not assimilation, but multiculturalism, so the upkeep of foreign cultures, foreign religions, etc. And it did that partially because it wanted to now pander more perhaps towards a kind of university-educated, cosmopolitan, urban clientele that was comfortable with and in fact embraced multiculturalism and embraced a less ethnically homogeneous society. With that, it shot itself in the foot quite dramatically, right? Because a lot of voters simply jumped ship. They were unhappy and either dropped out and didn't participate in elections anymore, or moved to the far right, where it existed, embracing, in other words, an anti-immigration, not necessarily anti-immigrant, but anti-immigration and pro-restriction stance. And with that, we turn to a dilemma which the center-left nowadays faces when it comes to the immigration issue. And that is that, of course, you can't really please all, right? You have to take a stance. And the problem here is that if you take a stance that is particularly supportive of immigration, you tend to alienate and lose voters that are part of your traditional core clientele. Right? So the blue-collar voters tend to be not particularly enthusiastic about yet more immigration and a liberal integration policy. And at the same time, you're chasing after people who typically are lost to your party anyway. Right? In other words, those voters that are supportive of these kind of policies I just described tend to, where they exist, tend to go for alternatives anyway. They don't vote for the Social Democrats, they don't vote for the Socialists. They see them as old-fashioned, staid, a bit boring, a bit established, but rather they jump ship and go to the far left. Right? So if you have voters who are truly in favor of yet higher levels of immigration and abandoning assimilation, instead going for a multicultural approach towards immigration, you are typically talking voters who have likewise abandoned the Social Democrats, but not for the far right, of course, but for the far left. So it's a dilemma here because if you try to swerve towards the left, and that is what social democratic parties by and large have done, you're chasing after voters who often have already given up on you. At the same time, you're also leaving behind voters who perhaps on other issues would be inclined to vote for you, but on immigration are much more conservative. So this is a dilemma which is not an easy one to solve. I pointed towards the Danish case there earlier, which has attracted a great deal of attention, at least in Europe, because it seems to suggest that you can move to the center on immigration and actually not lose voters, but regain some of the voters from the far right. Right? And again, we're talking about centrist policies here, not extremism, not xenophobia. We're just talking about essentially more robust policies on integration. Okay, the number 6 is the big question of how to deal with the EU. Right? What will happen there? Where does the center left stand? Where should it stand on European integration? Time was, and I and many other scholars have described that in considerable detail, time was that the European center left clinged on to the vision of the single market, which is a very liberal, a very pro-market, a very pro-business project. The single market will be complemented by a more social element, by some kind of protective second tier that would deal with some of the inequities and some of the inequalities, some of the negative fallout, in other words, that a single market would produce through more competition, through a bit more pressure on companies, a bit more pressure, of course, also on employees. Now, that was the vision that Jacques Delors promised back in the 1990s. And many on the left were inclined to believe him. Right? He was a French socialist after all. He seemed to be credible when he talked about the social package that should complement the single market. The trouble is that, I think it's fair to say, 20 years hence, we know that this is really somewhat of a mirage. Right? It's an illusionary concept. It hasn't materialized. You have 27 extremely social-culturally, social-economically diverse member states in the EU. It's simply impossible to find some kind of common ground, minimal social regulation. A lot of countries don't want any of it. They don't want a minimal floor, they don't want any floor. Politically, this is essentially a non-starter, and it's hard to see where the impetus should come from now, right? We're also 25 years out from Mr. Delors' era. So it's simply a non-starter. The one point some of my critics might point to is the fact that we now see in the aftermath of COVID noises coming out of the Commission that would point towards a kind of neo-Keynesian approach, well, right, sort of the European equivalent to Build Back Better, put massive amounts of money into the infrastructure, especially in Southern Europe, and in that sense try to kickstart economic growth in classic Keynesian fashion. That is a valid point, but it seems to be more the exception than the rule. I don't really see how this can lead us to presume that we're witnessing the rebirth of social Europe. Right, we're looking at a very contingent set of circumstances. We just lived through one of the worst pandemic in human history, singular. And in that sense, it's not clear that this is really pointing us into the direction where we comfortably say, yes, this is our zero for a social democratic Europe. Right? Evidence isn't there. Again, at the risk of repeating myself slightly, we can't just go back to Keynes and say, all right, what we need is more spending at the national level and more pump priming of the demand side there. We're simply hemmed in to the extent that these countries are in the Eurozone by the criteria of the single currency, right? And they are already at record levels of public debt. If you look at the data there, right, you know that there are a number of European countries, especially in the South, that have triple-digit levels of debt relative to gross domestic product. That is precarious, as it is. To layer on top of that is risky, to say the least. So all that to say is, if you want to use the recipes of the 1980s and 1990s, A, there's no real appetite for it anymore, B, there's no impetus, C, there's no money. So you have to think of a new vision for the EU from a center-left perspective. And there, we're simply saying it's not clear what that vision looks like at present, and voters are responding to that. So that's another one where there's essentially a dearth or an absence of a vision. The hope, in some sense, back in the 1990s was also that there would be some kind of European, you might say, counterpole to globalization. Globalization with a human face, and rhetoric such as that was bandied about back in that era. Here we are 25 years hence. We don't really know what that means, what that is, and it hasn't materialized. So again, it's simply not clear what the center-left's vision for European integration might be. And that is the sixth theme of the book. We point simply to an absence of vision there. So to wrap up, because we're reaching our 45-minute time limit here, what we're doing in the book is describing and analyzing the decline of the center-left. Right? We collectively picked up on the fact that social and social democratic parties that used to be really Volksparteien, that used to be really the party of the people, used to command north of 40% of the vote, today are in some extreme cases more hovering around the 20% mark, and that's a dramatic decline. And even in countries where they're holding up, they're doing significantly worse than they used to historically. Why is that? We focused our studies around the six themes I outlined. We're also finding that in a number of European countries, there's really been an explosion of mini and macro parties. That is to say, there's what we call the Netherlandization, right, with 14 different parties in parliament. And in that sense, it is perhaps simply more difficult for the Social Democrats to hold together a clientele of voters which today is in some sense self-selecting into micro parties, and that will be a challenge in itself to try to push back there and regain at least some of those voters. We're also, to recap, we're also looking at two countries which seem to defy the trend a little bit. Austria has moved to the left on social and economic issues and seems to be doing quite well with that stance. Right? So the Austrian Social Democratic parties, of course, also face a dilemma of being challenged on the far left by the Greens on issues to do more with social cultural things, such as, for example, immigration. But they seem to be doing reasonably well with their left-wing stance on political economy. And the Danes seem to have come back using a different approach, namely by moving towards the right on immigration. And so they have essentially defied the naysayers and demonstrated that if you go into a direction where your voting class clientele stands, namely you insist on tougher rules on the right to migrate to Denmark, and you also impose more of a, you might say, to-do list for new immigrants, especially asylum seekers, that actually works very well with the voters. Right? They reward that stance, and you are able to weaken the far right, you bring back voters from the far right, and you bolster your support, especially amongst the working class. So this is, in many ways, perhaps not the most optimistic of stories, right? We're looking at perennial decline. We're looking at a few exceptions that seem to prove the trend rather than defy it. But it also, in many ways, speaks to the very fluid politics that we have in Europe at the moment, and the challenges that have arisen over the course of the past 20 years, many of which have not been dealt with very well, programmatically and ideologically. And in that sense, it is perhaps not altogether surprising that the center-left is hurting so badly. As a final point, we're also now thinking about changing our prism slightly and looking at the center-right, because of course we're also aware of the fact that there are a number of Christian democratic parties which are similarly struggling, and this what we call Netherlandization is of course also affecting the center-right, which is similarly under siege and is also shedding voters, albeit more to the far right, of course, than anything else. All right, so let me wrap up here and open the floor. If there are any questions, I'm more than happy to entertain them.
So you've said a lot of different things, and you've made a lot of different points, and I do have some questions, but I really want to see what the audience's reaction is, and what questions you might have.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you mentioned how there's a decline in the working class just across Europe, and I'm wondering if that necessarily means a decrease in voting power.
Let's see, let me go back to the slide where we addressed that. Here we are. Yeah, I mean the empirical reality is that in the blue collar milieu, those that are de facto and those who self-identify as working class individuals is shrinking. And of course part of that is really deindustrialization, so one might expect that part of that trend simply has to do with a decline in manufacturing job, but it could be compensated by the growth in the service sector, right? We're now in decade 6 of the trend towards tertiarization. The trouble is, in the service sector, the Social Democrats tend to struggle. Service is an extremely broad term. It covers everything from lawyers to cleaning ladies. So you're talking there about an enormous amount of diversity in terms of levels of remuneration, working conditions, prestige, etc. And at the top end, you tend to be dealing with voters who are more towards the left on the kind of social cultural issues such as the environment, immigration, LGBTQ, etc., etc. At the bottom, you tend to deal with people who are often very, very hard to organize in any shape or form, either from a union perspective or a party perspective. So even though de facto these people are the precariat, right, they are the new working class, you might say, they are paid very poorly, their job has no prestige whatsoever, and their working conditions are quite onerous. In actual fact, they are loath to join the Social Democrats or the Socialists, and they're very difficult to unionize as well. That is to say, they are, in many ways, you might say, the new obvious target groups for the center-left de facto because of how they work and what they get paid, but the left struggles to organize them. To the extent that we have seen studies on that, this is a group of individuals who simply tend not to vote either. Right? I didn't speak much in my talk about party membership levels. That's something we also looked at empirically. That is to say, we're not just interested in voting, but also in membership. And here too, we've really seen an atrophy of membership, right? So I wrote the chapter on Germany, and we've seen a 50% drop in membership since the year 2000. The party used to have 800,000 people, which was not bad. It's now down to 400,000. And if you go back further in time, you see that the rot started in the 1990s, but it's really accelerated this side of the 21st century. I mention that because the center-left parties in a number of European countries also had a whole ecosystem of choirs, of bowling alleys, of youth groups. You could do all manners of social activities under the auspices of a group that was loosely affiliated with a political party. And that whole ecosystem has withered and died, simply gone. Right? So you are, in that sense, really looking at a fairly dramatic atrophy of engagement, including at a very social and perhaps less than downright ideological and political one, but certainly simply a decline of what used to ultimately generate prospective members for the party.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Yeah, sure.
So I'm kind of thinking of like the blue-collar situation in Europe compared to America. And in America, we've seen that like blue-collar workers or people who don't really work in like the white-collar industry, Donald Trump's populism has garnered a significant support from this group of people. So I'm wondering if Europe is primed for populism.
I think, I mean, to the extent that you find parties that are successful in poaching these kind of voters, they often are populist parties, or they are, and I personally prefer the term anti-establishment parties from either the far left or the far right. And here, to get back to one of the points I made, here you're also talking about a clientele which, on many of these social cultural issues, is distinctly unhappy and uncomfortable with left-wing positions. For example, on you might say more cultural questions such as homosexual marriage, etc. Really, which is not a political economy question at all. It's really a, well, not lifestyle, but it's a social cultural ideational question. This is where the Social Democrats, to the extent that they go along with the flow and take a more left of center position, often lose voters. And the winners of that are indeed the anti-establishment parties. And some of these parties also, it must be said, really reinvented themselves over the course of the past 2 decades. If you consider, for example, the situation in France, Mrs. Le Pen has, in some sense, really revived and dusted off the French far right. And it speaks on political economy to the working class. Right? It takes positions that a generation ago were associated with the French Communist Party. So it speaks about protectionism, bolstering the welfare state, looking out for the little guy, the proverbial little guy. And of course, on social cultural issues, it takes a distinctly right-wing position, for example, on immigration, et cetera. So this is a policy mix which works quite well in that kind of clientele.
Okay, thank you.
So let's see who else might have a question.
Yeah, I see one hand in the back.
Actually, I have 2 sorts of related questions to the previous one. So firstly, is there a particular reason as to why the service industry workers do not tend to unionize that we know of?
That's a good question. I think at the you would probably have to point towards almost a kind of cultural vestige in that trade unions across Europe simply struggle to reach out to service sector employees in general, including well qualified service sector workers. So the studies I've seen always suggest that you get at the top end individuals who are simply loath to unionize and see the union more as an impediment than anything else, and don't really want to become union members and see it essentially as an unnecessary burden. A third party that no one really needs. They prefer to negotiate individually with their employers. If you look at, for example, highly skilled IT workers, etc. And then at the lower end, you get individuals that are simply a bit hard to reach and hard to appeal to. But your question is an excellent one. There's not a lot of social science studies on that particular question. My hunch would be that it really has to do perhaps more with somewhat of a path-dependent embedded position where European unions always went after manufacturing workers and then simply struggled a bit to modernize and appeal to workers of a very, very different background.
So my second question relating to the decrease in the link between the working class and center-left parties. Mm-hmm. I am wondering, is it a particularly post-World War II, or is it a particularly modern phenomenon, or has that occurred earlier when the social situations are somewhat similar? As in, for example, when American manufacture is increasing, competing with Europe earlier in history.
Are you referring to this point here? Is that what your question pertains to? Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay, yeah. I mean, I think it's fair to say that. I mean, if you go back and look at pre-World War II European centre-left parties, such as the French Socialists or the British Labour Party or the German Social Democrats, you did occasionally have people who, by background, were really part of the middle class and were university graduates and were perhaps acting in solidarity with the lower socioeconomic echelons, but were not of that class themselves. But by and large, the party was made up, including at the more senior levels, by individuals who came from that class originally and essentially had rose through the ranks. And I mean, you can criticize that the fact that a lot of them had essentially risen through the union hierarchy, and in that sense were often products of the culture of the trade union movement, and that was essentially the ultimate ladder on their social ascent was the switch over into the centre-left party and then the representation in parliament. But they did, by and large, more credibly represent the working class by virtue of their own biography and their own background. Yeah.
So on the question of like the welfare state and like how it's going to look in the future, do the center-left parties sort of accept that, just because of like changing technology, that there'll be like a solid like block of people that are constantly just in and out of work, and would they is there like talk of of having some sort of universal basic income, or how are they dealing with that sort of reality of like the shifting job market and the new skills that are required and how quickly that can change and keep people unemployed?
Yeah, you're tapping into an interesting set of questions there. The slight problem is that we're at the cusp of major change, and if you look at what's out there in terms of studies on the impact of automation on the labor market, it is extremely vague and fuzzy. I went through a lot of this, and a lot of it is not really written by academics. It's written more by research departments of investment banks. And a lot of it is, I don't use the term speculative lightly, but it is essentially making educated guesses about what the employment impact might be. So to give you an example, the European Commission did a study on the impact of automation on the European labor market and said between 6 and 60% of all jobs in Europe will be affected one way or other. I mean, that's a pretty broad range, right? 6 and 60 is a world of difference. 6 would be marginal, 60 would be massive. So that's an, I think, important, you might say, proviso. A lot of the work in this field is perhaps by necessity still very, very embryonic. We, in that sense, are quantitatively not entirely sure yet how severe the impact will be. Similarly, if you look at individual case country studies, they say the larger countries, France, Germany, will have 500,000 jobs being lost. That's a lot, that's massive, but it's not necessarily earth-shattering. Right? It will be hitting the affected individuals very hard, but it won't somehow upset the entirety of the political economy in those two countries. So that's I think, worth bearing in mind. But your question is a good one in that it points to the difficulty of rapidly redeploying individuals who've been laid off, who lost previous forms of employment. And the idea of a basic income is one that we float in the book as a policy proposal. I don't think it's gained a great deal of traction yet. There are some countries where it's being bandied about, but it's not, I don't think, widely discussed across Europe. And one model, again, from Denmark that has attracted some interest, at least in scholarly circles, is the idea of flexicurity. And what that means is that you combine flexibility with security. You have a relatively generous welfare state, which pays people, in the first instance, 80% of their last net salary if they get laid off. But they also have to put up with the fact that essentially they have American levels of job security, namely practically none, right? It's very, very easy to fire people in Denmark, so you can lose your job in a heartbeat. But you also, in some sense, fall on a very comfortable cushion in the first instance. And then down the road, of course, it goes down from 80%, but you do have ample time to look for a new job. Something like that is at least worth discussing, I think, in terms of the impact of automation and artificial intelligence. The Danish employers are less loath to take on new employees because they know that if need be, they can also let them go relatively easily, so you don't have that problem, which is a big one in parts of the south of Europe, especially Italy. So it's worth contemplating, certainly, and having that flexicurity approach. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Let's say some of the causes of the decline in the parties were to kind of alleviate the decline in the size of the working class, or the center-left stance on economic issues. Do you see the effects lessening or reversing at all?
Towards the towards the very end, I mean, in the concluding chapter, we contemplate the question of the road ahead and ask ourselves: is there a way to, in some sense, arrest the decline and perhaps even turn it around? And we get back to where do I have it, this fundamental dilemma, right? Where do you go on political economy versus where do you go on social cultural questions? This is, of course, an inherently ideological question in some sense, right? Where do you position the party? I don't know if there's really a right or wrong answer. It's really a politically conditioned answer. It seems that if you move too far to the left on social cultural issues, you tend to lose voters more than you can gain them. And you tend to lose towards the far left, right? You get your Green Party challengers, or you get your post-communist challengers. You lose voters there anyway, and things like identity politics, homosexual marriage, extreme forms of multiculturalism where you embrace a kind of anything goes approach towards immigrants, those are all the sort of things that play extremely poorly in front of a working class audience. You really are losing very badly, come across as being out of touch, preoccupied with issues that have no real bearings on their quotidian, everyday reality. So that I don't think works terribly well. Some of my co-authors would probably disagree with me on that, but I think that veer towards the left on these issues has not worked very well electorally at all. On the political economy, it's even perhaps more of a loaded issue. It's even harder to answer decisively. We have with Austria a country where the party moves to the left and is rewarded for it. Right? It abandons the whole third way stance. It abandons the whole let's make the welfare state leaner and meaner stance from the early 2000s, and says, no, actually the welfare state needs to be more generous, right? But it also has to be said, and that's the point I didn't make in the presentation, some of this is rhetoric more than substance, right? Nobody wants to go back to renationalizing big parts of the Austrian economy, nobody, right? There's a lot of flirtation with left-wing, almost neo-Marxist rhetoric. But if you look at policy output and if you look at specific policy proposals in the manifesto, again, we're not going back to the 1970s where Austria had a larger public sector than Yugoslavia. Nobody wants to go back to that, including the left. So it is, as the saying goes, it is kind of setting the indicator on the left, but not necessarily swerving to the left. It is, there's an element there of flirting with rhetoric, and then being pragmatic enough perhaps to not swerve quite as far to the left as you suggest to your voters. But it is moving to the left, and it seems to work for the Austrian Social Democrats quite well. So perhaps the way forward is exactly that, moving towards the center or towards the right on social cultural matters and moving to the left on political economy. Other hands? Yep.
In general, do you find the transition, the post-industrial transition to, let's say, higher ages of people leading to less birth rates as well, does that pose an issue for the future of the European welfare system?
Oh, definitely, yeah. Definitely not. It's a big problem. If you look at reproduction rates, right, total fertility rate is usually the metric we use. It needs to be 2.1 to maintain current population levels, right, because we have, unfortunately, still a bit of infant mortality, and we have people who die in accidents, et cetera. So it needs to be above 2, it needs to be 2.1. And that level is reached at current, I think only in 3 European countries, France, Ireland, and I think also Poland. So that means that some European countries are already shrinking. Others are projected to shrink going forward. Because very clearly, if an average couple has less than 2 children, that means that the next generation will be considerably smaller. And at the risk of pointing out the bleedingly obvious, people who aren't born can't have kids. So that means that going forward, you will have a kind of spiraling effect. Now, bear in mind with demography, you're always dealing with a descriptive science, right? It's not a predictive science. So in that sense, we're extrapolating from current trends. And we can, of course, in that sense, make predictions presuming that current trends will continue. If you look at the Hungarians, right, who are putting in place income tax cuts for people who have 3 or more children, there are public policy measures in place that try to redress that. The French have their école maternelle system, their pre-kindergarten, I should say pre-kindergarten tier in place. You can give your kid away from the age of 18 months onwards, as very young. So it is possible to try to counteract that kind of demographic development. But to answer the question, it really is a problem, yes, because the traditional assumption was that you have a steady ratio of contributors to the pension systems and those drawing on them. Right? When Otto von Bismarck, the cherished founding father of the Bismarckian-style welfare system in continental Europe, put in place the German pension system back in the 19th century, he set the pensionable age at 2 years above the average life expectancy of Germany at the time. And so, in other words, quite cunningly, knowing that very few people would actually be able, physically able, to draw on the pensions. Today we have almost the exact opposite situation. That is to say, we send people into pension at age 65 or sometimes even younger, 63, and the average life expectancy is 80. Right? That's a good thing, but it means that you have individuals who draw on pensions for much longer. And at some point, something has to give. You can't have people drawing on pensions for 20 years as opposed to 2 or 3 years back in the 1950s, and at the same time have an unfavorable ratio between those paying into the pension fund, those in employment, and those taking out by virtue of being 65, or in some countries 63 plus, right? That's a real problem. It's in some sense somewhat of a technocratic problem, and I know I sometimes lose students when I discuss it because a lot of people, in their early 20s are not that interested or fascinated by pension issues, understandably so. But it is important politically, no doubt. And the way that politicians deal with it is often in a fairly opportunistic fashion. Nobody wants to be the quote-unquote bad guy to raise the retirement age. And there is something of a stopgap measure character to it. Yes, you can kick it up by a year or two, but the fundamental problem would probably have to be also redressed by looking into ways to encourage people to have larger families. It's a little outside of the remit of the book, but it's a valid point you raised, definitely, and it is a huge problem going forward. Yep.
Of course, the European Commission has a solution,
What?
which is
More immigration? No.
Which is immigration,
Okay, yeah.
right?
Yeah, but that raises then the question of integration, etc. But that's true. Yeah, that's often wheeled out as a potential policy approach, definitely.
So
Yeah.
we're almost out of time, and I think what I'd like to sort of the main comment I'd like to make is that from a lot of the questions that came from the students, I think a lot of the questions were pointing towards the possibility or the way in which these parties that are the mainstream center-left traditional parties that have been around for a long time could possibly strengthen their ties to the precariat. And I think you have explained that the precariat is a term, by the way, which is used for people who work in poor conditions and with poor employment standards. So if you don't have any employment security, if you have low wages, that's what the Europeans call the precariat. It seems like a lot of the comments, a lot of the questions were saying, what is it that is preventing these parties, if they have this issue on social cultural matters on the one hand, what is preventing them from establishing that connection to those potential workers, to mobilize those potential workers? Seems like a lot of the questions were going in that direction. Okay, well, thank you for presenting this
It's my
work,
pleasure, yeah.
And I look forward to the volume and to seeing what you and your co-authors have to say.
Okay, great. Yeah, sounds good.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you.